It is time now for the first of our two panels. We will begin with a discussion on livelihoods and the role of Indigenous peoples and local communities in the conservation and sustainable use of forests. To discuss, Ms. Amy Fraenkel, Executive Secretary of the Convention on Migratory Species, CMS, Ms. Iliana Monterroso, Environmental Scientist at the Equity, Gender, Justice, and Tenures team of the Center for International Forestry Research, CIFOR, and Mr. Leif Fosse, Senior Advisor at the Norwegian International Climate and Forest Initiative, and Ms. Dilys Rowe, Chair of the IUCN Sustainable Use and Livelihood Specialist Group, or IUCN SULI, Sungai Utik Community in West Kalimantan, Indonesia. From a message by Ms. Nemonte Nenquimo, founder of the Ecuadorian NGO Alianza Ceibo and laureate of the 2020 Equator Prize.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Nemonte Nenquimo, soy mujer guaraní, líder de comunidad de Pastaza. Aquí estoy en una limitación del territorio guaraní. Por acá, por arriba, es donde están cortando las maderas, donde es mi territorio, nuestro territorio guaraní, donde hay una diversidad grande, donde nosotros vivimos como pueblos indígenas, que conservamos nuestro territorio, que tenemos tipo de diversidad de los animales. Nosotros vivimos por miles de años y protegemos y guardamos y cuidamos porque nos ha dado vida para nosotros y el alimento, el consumo, la vida del pueblo indígena mismo. Ustedes que están escuchando, ambientalistas, los derechos humanos, que asuman esta lucha para que podamos confrontado, para que tengan ese oxígeno y el agua y para la vida que amamos nosotros. Que tengan un lindo día y saludamos desde la Amazonía ecuatoriana.
Thank you, Ms. Nenquimo, for your powerful message that brings home experience in government and servicing multilateral environmental agreements. Could you share with us your vision for how we can better plan and implement measures to avert forest?
To join our sister convention, CITES, and the many other distinguished speakers on this World Wildlife Day. Now, of course, that is a rather big question. First, much work is needed to move food systems onto a sustainable forestation. And with a growing population, food insecurity will put considerable use of forest biodiversity. Direct use of wild animals. While wild meat is an important source of food for many people, unsustainable use of wild species is a major concern, including growing domestic consumption not involving international trade. Third, if that wasn't hard enough, we need to confront the underlying drivers, which all global environmental change has in common, i.e. our economic models, consumption patterns and choices and values. So how do we do that? Communicating, understanding, and acting on the value of terms. It is also about seizing opportunities for change. COVID shined a spotlight on the need to move forward in a different way, and there are incredible opportunities for shifting how we live, work, and enjoy life on this planet. Now, coming to the theme of this panel, Indigenous peoples and local communities have a particularly important role to play and can be most directly impacted by pressures on migratory species and habitats and forests. While CMS is a global treaty, conservation of migratory species has to happen in the places where people and wild species live. There are many initiatives under CMS that involve IPLCs. To give just a few examples, one is the gorilla and chimpanzee work in Africa, where revenue and park fees and permits provide vital resources for parks and rangers, and local communities benefit through jobs and other revenue. Another example is the joint CMS-CITES African Carnivores Initiative, which addresses conservation of lions, leopards, cheetahs, and wild dogs, and aims to reduce human-animal conflicts and promote engagement of local communities. Finally, our last Conference of the Parties a year ago adopted a decision on community participation and livelihoods in the conservation and management of CMS-listed species. We will be gathering case studies and recommend future actions to assist our parties in using community-based initiatives for the conservation and management of CMS-listed species. Let me close by saying how much we look forward to continuing our joint work with CITES and many of the organizations that are participating today. I wish you all a very happy World Wildlife Day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy, for sharing with us your thoughts on forest ecosystem services, the reasons that we have the drivers for the loss of forests, such as agriculture, which you mentioned, and the dire need for sustainable use, and especially the involvement of indigenous people and local communities. I just wanted to ask a related question, just a follow-up question, in terms of these partnerships that you spoke of, such as the ones that with CITES that you have, that we have together, and others. Do you see any hope in the future for further partnerships, particularly with business and industry, as we talk about agricultural expansion? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Business plays a key role, and there are so many businesses around the world that are stepping up and taking it into not just as an extra step that they do because it's a nice thing to do, but because it actually affects their business bottom line. And if you look at issues, for example, on migratory species, we see issues related to connectivity. Connectivity is essential for migratory species, meaning that they have to be able to follow their natural rhythms and move. And that's the same with water and within forest ecosystems. There's got to be uninterrupted, if you will, pathways. So businesses are seeing that, and when they put in infrastructure and physical developments, they also are more and more taking that into account. For example, road infrastructure and building it in a way that migratory species can pass. So it's beneficial for them. It will stop kind of complaints about it if we get it right the first time, and legal fees and stoppages of projects. So we need to take those values into the accounting of businesses, and that will be a huge contribution to our work.
Thanks, Amy, for those additional words about partnering up with business. We, of course, look very much forward at CITES to continue our work with CMS, but I would like to put our heads together to see how we can also work with businesses, I think, especially when it comes to habitats, to make sure that they are building better, especially now after the pandemic. So let's work together, continue working together on that. Thank you so much. I would now like to turn to Ms. Iliana Monterroso and ask her a question based on her vast experience as well, working at the field level with communities, local communities and indigenous peoples. Ms. Monterroso, what are the lessons learned by CIFOR, the organization you work for, include a little bit about your personal experiences in the Latin American region in particular, in empowering and engaging communities, including through forest tenure reform? We heard a little bit about this, both from the speaker from the Quinault Indian Nation and also from Elizabeth and Rema, how we have to empower and engage communities. And perhaps you can add a little something about women's participation in your answer as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ivonne. It's quite an honor to participate in the celebration of the World Wildlife Day and this panel in particular. Thank you also to those connected. Greetings from Guatemala. As you may know, and as it has been mentioned before, across the globe, women and men depend on forests, trees, and biodiversity for their livelihoods and play a critical role in managing them. CIFOR works to fully understand the dynamics that influence the ways in which women and men engage with forests, trees, and biodiversity, the sets of knowledge people develop around these resources, in particular local communities and indigenous peoples, and the different ways in which they are impacted by environmental changes. So to address your question, I would like to share with you 3 factors that highlight some lessons learned from our research on forest tenure reforms across developing countries, and also around how improved women participation in forest decision-making can lead to transformational gains, including governance and sustainable forest management. So the first lesson that I would like to highlight is that participation is a key step to address barriers women face, not only in decision-making, but also in key issues like rights and benefit sharing. Addressing these barriers would be an effective way to sustain forests and wildlife. But however, existing barriers are related to different factors. But just to refer quickly to two major constraints we have come across several times in our research. One important limiting factor being the discriminatory laws and harmful practices that limit rights and constrain women's ability to gain their full potential and agency. For instance, CIFOR research around Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Colombia, Nepal, Peru, and Indonesia show important progress in forest tenure reforms, which means, governments changes in legislations to recognize or transfer rights to indigenous peoples or local communities inhabiting forest areas. However, this research also highlights the possibility these reforms also reinforcing social differentiation, unless specific provisions are included to address how women, indigenous peoples, and local communities will be engaged in implementation processes, the rights they gain, and the type of benefits they can derive from these changes in regulations. Fortunately, gender and inclusive responsive legal reforms can also be great opportunities to address these barriers. A second common barrier refers to the set of norms and responsibilities that may hinder women's or indigenous peoples' ability to engage effectively in decision-making, rules and norms that constrain their ability and resources to mobilize, rules that constrain access to training and information will hinder their ability to speak in public spaces. Recent CIFOR research on multi-stakeholder forums in countries such as Brazil, Indonesia, Ethiopia, and Peru shows that outcomes of participatory spaces should also focus on strengthening abilities of women and indigenous peoples and other marginalized groups. This means to empower them to make strategic choices and take decisions, as well as increase awareness and address barriers to engagement. Our second lesson is that active involvement of women and indigenous peoples in decision-making is important for governance, as well as ensuring equitable outcomes. This requires actions to build capacities to strengthen both individual and collective agency, supporting women, indigenous peoples, and other marginalized groups to organize. This has been shown once and again in the study of community forest user groups across the globe, which have highlighted the importance of engaging these groups not only by the use of quotas as affirmative actions to address inclusion, but also raising the need to go beyond this to address issues around membership and decision-making rules. Showing that even in cases when women and indigenous peoples are invited to the table, we need to make sure as well they are also able to make decisions on equal footing as the rest of participants. This requires addressing power dynamics stemming from different factors that often intersect, including class, caste, ethnicity, and generation. So factors that operate on multiple levels, determining how women engage in decision-making, the set of rights they are recognized, and the type of benefits they can obtain. So finally, natural resource management interventions, including those related to forests and wildlife, have important implications for women and indigenous peoples' labor, time, and decision-making. However, gender equality and inclusion are both human rights and are essential for achieving sustainable development. Therefore, participation in forest governance and wildlife management should be considered as a right in itself. Consequently, conditions to ensure that women and indigenous groups are active agents in decision-making should be perceived not only as an effective and inclusive development solution, but also our collective responsibility for all of those involved in forests as well as wildlife management. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Monterroso, you have so many wonderful experiences to share from working at the community level, especially some lessons learned that show that there have been improvements. It's not all bad news. There's been improvements with changes in legislation at the national level to include for inclusivity with women and indigenous peoples. I wonder if you've had an opportunity to think about, a lot of this applies to the national level, I would imagine. Have you had an opportunity to think about how this could apply at the international level for those of us working with multilateral environmental agreements and wanting to try to find ways in how we carry out our programs, especially when you talk about ensuring that there's participation from women and from indigenous people? Do you have any ideas to share with us for those of us working at the international level with our multilateral environment agreements?
I apologize. I think I have some problems listening to the question.
No worries. I'll ask you again, and you can leave your video off. Yes, and if you leave your video off in case that is helpful. No, I was just mentioning the fact that you had given us a lot of good practices, lessons learned from working in the field, from working with different countries. That sounds like there's good news that legislation has been adopted for more inclusivity of Indigenous people and women. Do you have any suggestions for us working at the international level through the multilateral environmental agreements, for example, on how to ensure better participation of local communities, Indigenous people, and women in the way that we work in our programming? Well, I think we may have some problems with Ms. Monterroso and her connection. We will see later if she can come back on, and we can then ask her again the question. May I now move to Mr. Leif Fosse, if he's available? Yes. We can always ask the question again of Ms. Monterroso a little later. Leif, welcome, and thank you for participating in the panel. I wanted to ask you a question about a statement that's in the Norwegian International Climate and Forest Initiative. It says that Indigenous people can often be the best guardians of the forest. And we've heard a lot of Indigenous people themselves and some of the leaders like Elizabeth Ndrema, like the Antonio Guterres, the Secretary-General of the United Nations, say something about Indigenous people and how they're sort of the front line with the forest. Could you share with us how your work has demonstrated this, particularly your work in Southeast Asia?
Thank you. First of all, I should mention that the Norwegian International Climate and Forest Initiative is part of the Norwegian Ministry of Climate and Environment. So, yes, I'll be happy to outline under what circumstances that claim, which you refer to, holds true in our experience. I will not recap the mounting evidence for Indigenous peoples and local communities managing tropical forests more sustainably than actually anyone else. Because as you refer to, Ms. Nemonte and Nenquimo and previous speakers have already done that more eloquently than I could. Anyway, a cornerstone of our approach consists in long-term, results-based partnerships with key tropical forest countries. This ensures the ownership and sovereignty of the partner country. Norway also supports capacity building efforts and improved land use policies through multilateral channels and a host of civil society partners. So securing land rights and territorial management for Indigenous peoples and local communities are absolutely key in this agenda, but needs to form part of a broader forest governance and transparency approach. I'll get back to what I mean by that. A key part of this agenda, of this approach, is a new high social and environmental integrity tropical forest carbon market standard, referred to as ART-trees, which, by opening the gates for private finance into reducing emissions at large scale, provide a more effective incentive to tropical forest countries. Other enabling factors include transparency tools such as Global Forest Watch and Trace. Norway also procures and makes available for free higher resolution satellite imagery, enabling Indigenous peoples and civil society to track and expose illegal logging and mining. Together, these tools should help governments address forest crime and for everyone to shine a light on the supply chains of the commodities that we use and that drive deforestation. Finally, on the home front, Norway is involved in European and global initiatives to eliminate deforestation from commodity supply chains. as well as the financial markets that underpin them, so that sooner rather than later, investments in deforestation may become stranded assets. So results achieved by tropical forest countries pursuing this sort of a comprehensive approach include billions of CO2 avoided by Brazil, reducing its deforestation by 3/4 over a decade. This was a result of a range of successful forest governance reforms, including recognition of indigenous peoples' rights to manage their territories. While, unfortunately, the tide has turned in that country, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Guyana carry that torch forward by recognizing territorial management by indigenous peoples and local communities, and pursuing results-based financing for these and other forest governance reforms. Specialized instruments that we support, such as the Tenure Facility, has advanced indigenous peoples and local community management over as much as 14 billion hectares of forest land across Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and aim to add 10 more million hectares in the next couple of years. While recognition of the role of indigenous peoples in forest management appears to be most difficult, perhaps in Central Africa, certain advances are being made there too on the legislative front in the Republic of Congo as well as in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Our community-based natural resource management, which I suspect the next speaker, Dilys, will talk about as well, in Southern and Eastern Africa has already demonstrated that potential, such as in Namibia, where last time I checked, as much as 10% of the population is involved in community conservation over large areas, protecting wildlife and securing their livelihoods in the process. So, while global forest loss continues apace, Indonesia has reduced emissions in the last few years by enforcing its legislation and protecting forests and peatlands. Now, AMAN, the umbrella organization for indigenous peoples in Indonesia, is making effective use of new legislation for indigenous peoples to demarcate close to 2 million hectares of forest land. Now, with as much as 70 million indigenous peoples in Indonesia claiming a similar amount of land, the potential is, of course, much, much bigger. NGOs such as Hamdana Institute and the World Resources Institute in Indonesia help ensure that such advances are scaled up by recognition in district and national land use planning and regulations, as well as the Ministry of Forestry and Environment social forestry programs. In Vietnam too, which is a former NICFI partner, government found that delegating forest management authority to ethnic minorities and local communities, in this way they could restore depleted forest and biodiversity much more effectively as soon as forest and land laws allowed for it. All this is to say that while much progress can be made by indigenous communities at local level, it needs to go to scale and form part of a broad forest governance and transparency agenda that is owned also at the national and global level, especially in the face of our pandemic. That's why we also support the voice of indigenous peoples and local communities in the global climate and biodiversity negotiations just referred to, so that the full potential of indigenous peoples and local communities forest management can be recognized in the nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement and to help increase ambition by all parties, which we so desperately need. So in closing, I would like to recognize the contributions of the previous panelists, which provides great learning for our approach, which is all about acting on the science, the wisdom of indigenous peoples and local communities' traditional knowledge, and their forest management practices, as well as the examples provided by tropical forest countries leading the way through forest governance reform. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leif, and for sharing with us a vast array of ways in which you're making interventions at the local level, international level, and not only with the local communities, which is very important in the indigenous people, but also with industry when you talk about value chains and the way that business works, sometimes not taking too much into account what the impacts are of their business on the environment. So this is a very important aspect of it. So these are great insights. And well, being an economist myself and a great believer in incentives, and in fact, payment for ecosystem services, which I wonder if you know about what that entails. I find that some of the things that you're talking about is about payment for ecosystem services, because you are providing some funding to the local communities and to the indigenous people to change behavior, to be able then to conserve these resources at the global level. Do you have anything to add about that in general, if you see it in terms of what you're talking about, global forest governance? Do you see that this is the type of mechanisms that we have to put in place in general, such as what you're doing in terms of ensuring that there are incentives to conserve? You're muted, Leif. Can we unmute Leif, please? Hold on just a second. Oh, maybe I can unmute you. I think you have to answer my requests. This is the new normal now with virtual means. There you go.
Thank you so much. Sorry about that. Yeah, that's a great question. And if you'll have me to reminisce for a moment, your question reminds me of my previous placement in WWF, working on community-based natural resource management. And one thing I learned back then, which connects very nicely, I think, to how one needs to work with local communities or indigenous communities, or even globally, is that incentives needs to be closely tied to payments or benefits. Otherwise, people won't see the picture or won't have the motivation to do what's right or in their longer term interest. So that applies at all levels. At the same time, though, with international climate action, it is a fact that the nation states are the parties to those negotiations, meaning that the incentive becomes some more convoluted for the direct actors on the ground. But even so, we have to make sure that the incentive is clear to all actors across all levels, even though that is difficult. But the increasing recognition we see of the importance of indigenous peoples and local communities forest management is certainly the way forward here, while recognizing all the other drivers and the factors that needs to be taken into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those additional thoughts. Very, very, very enlightening. And I think you're absolutely right. It is not easy, but not many things are easy. But I think we can do it. And I think we can look at how to make sure that there's transparency and good forest governance by working all together, both at the global level and at the national level with legislation and better implementation, and working with, of course, with the indigenous communities and local communities. Thank you so much, Leif, for your excellent and eye-opening remarks. Thank you. Now I would like to turn to Ms. Dilys Rowe. Ms. Rowe, dear Dilys, could you join us? Thank you so much. Great to see you. I wanted to ask you a question that also based on your vast experience of working at the community level. We know that there seems to be a perception often that the threat to forest ecosystems is from the people who inhabit them or live near them. What lessons have been learned by yourself and the experts who work with you about the value, which we have been talking about now with different experiences, of engaging indigenous peoples and local communities to reach conservation objectives?
Thank you for the question, Ivonne. So before I move to the lessons that we've learned, just to first state, I think that this perception that you mentioned there, that the threat to forest ecosystems comes from people that inhabit or live near them, is a false one. And I think we need to be clear about that from the outset. So skeptics of the role of local people in conservation are really quick to point to things like charcoal burning or traditional practices like shifting agriculture, more derogatively called slash and burn agriculture. And indeed, not all local people have a benign effect on forests. Much of Africa's deforestation has been driven by subsistence agricultural activities, and with pressures to increase food production, as we've already mentioned, in order to meet a growing population, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. This is likely to get worse over the coming decade. But I think there's several really important things to remember. So in the first instance, these local practices vary hugely in intensity over time periods, so often causing just a temporary forest clearance rather than permanent deforestation. Secondly, even the temporary disruption that these practices cause pales into insignificance compared to commercial agricultural expansion and commodity production. So Global Forest Watch estimated that the global deforestation in 2019 was around 5.4 million hectares. 95% of this was in the tropics. And as Amy Fraenkel pointed out, the main driver of this is agriculture, including livestock production and production of commodities such as palm oil and soy, but also commercial logging. So these are activities that are driven by the commercial private sector, not by local people. And thirdly, unsustainable practices where they do happen, driven by local people, are often a reflection of weak rights, as we've mentioned in previous speakers have mentioned, poor governance, and also weak conservation incentives. So I think the lessons that we've learnt within SULI and elsewhere are that with the right incentives, with secure tenure and good and equitable governance, then local people, even if they have been causing deforestation, can become the best conservers of natural forest. So there's really good evidence that secure tenure enhances the quality of forest conditions. So it's not just good for Indigenous peoples and local communities to have that tenure, but it's also good for the forest. And evidence is particularly strong in countries that have got a strong history of supporting community-based forest management. So countries like Mexico, Nepal, Tanzania, and also countries that have got strong commitments to securing the land title of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And we see the same outside of the forest sector. So community-based wildlife management is reaping huge rewards in countries like Namibia, where the policy environment is supportive of locally managed wildlife, and local people have strong and secure rights to manage their land and manage and benefit from their wildlife in ways that suit their livelihoods. Sustainable use of wild resources is a key pillar of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, as we all know, and it's central to providing these strong conservation incentives for many IPLCs. So Amy pointed out that unsustainable utilisation is a major threat to biodiversity, and particularly in the forest context, the overhunting of forest animals. But what we've learned in SULI is that sustainable use is the opposite. And by providing a mechanism for supporting local people's livelihoods, it also provides a really strong incentive for conservation. So I'm sure, as you know, SULI's worked with the CITES Secretariat to develop a whole series of case studies of sustainable use of some CITES listed species, showing how their use is good for conservation and good for local people. But these are really just the tip of the iceberg. The role of sustainable use in a myriad of the less high profile species, from bamboos and rattans, honey, nuts, oils, all those kinds of non-timber forest products, is often under-acknowledged if recognised at all. So we quite often hear about the use of these things as being hidden. One of the first studies I came across when I started at IIED was called The Hidden Harvest, and it was all about the role of wild food in local people's livelihoods. but completely unaccounted for in formal statistics and unrecognized. We focus a lot in the conservation community on unsustainable use and on illegal use of wildlife, but we really need to better understand the role of sustainable and legal use. And this is something that SULI hopes to address going forward by building that evidence base on the sustainability of different types of uses, both in terms of their contributions to conservation, but also their contributions to local livelihoods and local economies. So we know that 1.3 billion IPLCs live in forests. More than 1.5 billion smallholders depend on forests. So it's obvious that it's not in their interest to destroy forests, but rather to find mechanisms that can meet their livelihood needs while at the same time protecting forests. And we know that to local people, these forests mean material goods to survive from day to day, but they're also a source of jobs and income, and they're critical in providing cultural identity, purpose, and fulfillment. So not only do local people try not to destroy forests, but they also contribute actively to their conservation. So Indigenous and community conserved areas, for example, vastly increase the amount of land that is under protection compared to formal state protected areas, so hugely contributing to global conservation targets. So the Amazon basin is a great example where the contributions of IPLCs to the conservation of tropical forests are clear. I mean, it's obvious that for millennia, they've been the natural stewards of the world's largest rainforest, but a growing body of evidence is showing their role in keeping these forest areas intact. So in particular, as well as preventing extractive activities on their own lands, because those activities are not compatible with their way of life, their territories also act as buffers to other lands where commercial extraction is going on and to the agricultural frontier. So according to Survival International, deforestation can be up to 20 times higher outside of Indigenous areas compared to inside them. And that in the Amazon, areas managed by Indigenous peoples have even lower deforestation rates than formal protected areas like national parks. So just to conclude, a key lesson that we've learned in SULI is that a major problem is that the rights of IPLCs to the land they occupy and to the resources they manage and utilize remains ambiguous and insecure. This is both in the Amazon and elsewhere. And even more worryingly, is that those rights that they do have, they seem to be being increasingly eroded rather than strengthened. And we've all heard of horror stories of Indigenous environmental defenders being tortured or murdered in order to prevent them standing up for their rights. Because more than a quarter of the world's forests are managed by IPLCs, and because 36% of intact forest landscapes overlap with IPLC land, their support in managing forests and the biodiversity within them is critical. And I think my sort of concluding thought is that without IPLCs, we really have to wonder if there is a future for forests. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dilys. You have been able to cover a number of things that have been concerns on my mind, particularly in the area of land conversion threats, because of not feeling that they own the land, that they or that they can have management rights over the land, thinking, why should I conserve this if I could do something else like plant crops? And so some of the things that you have referred to answer to that we have to give the right incentives, they have to have certain rights, these communities on their land with their resources within the land to be able to feel the ownership. And I think at the end of the day, it's about ownership and being able to guard, to be the guardians, the proper guardians because of the ownership. Thank you so much. Your work has been eye-opening. It's a pleasure to work with you as CITES. And I think we need to get the word out. Some of the things that you have said, I don't know if it's vastly and widely known. We have to work more on getting this information out about how critical it is to keep Indigenous people and local communities managing these lands to avoid having this land conversion that we worry about so much. Thank you, Dilys, very much, and looking forward to working with you further. And now I would like to turn to our youth representative, which is very exciting to have a young man with us today, Keenan Tiger, to talk to us a little bit about how young people think. In your experience, how have young people, particularly those who live close to forests and wildlife, been affected by forest loss? What do they expect from the global decision makers to act to change things?
Thank you for the question. It's such an honor to be here tonight. And to answer your question, the people here that I have seen firsthand have been affected dramatically by forest loss because they no longer have their forests. They start to lose their culture. They start to lose their roots, I guess, and because of that, they start to switch away from their traditional way of life into a more urban way, I guess you could say. And this is because with no forest left, they can't fulfill their daily needs the way that they used to, the way that they have done for hundreds, maybe millennia even. And that's all because the lack of resources in the forest. And where did all of the forest gone? Where did it go to? And in our case in Indonesia, much of it is turned into palm oil or illegally logged. And because of that, they need to fulfill their daily needs somehow. And because of that, they sometimes have to resort to working in these palm oil plantations in gold mines because they sort of don't have a choice. They're sort of driven into a corner. And that's really the main thing here, because if the forest is still pristine, it's still the way that it was when it was managed by the indigenous people, it would be able to fulfill their needs. And now less youths at the village. There's less youths at the village. Most of them are starting to move away, leaving only the elders there because of a lack of promise in the village, I guess you could say. And because of that, I think we need to sort of start moving away from such an extractive mindset, especially from legislation, and try to protect the remaining forests that we still have right now. And the best way to do that, as has been previously mentioned, is by granting indigenous people land rights. And the fact is that indigenous people are the best stewards of the land. But in Indonesia in particular, the process of gaining this legal recognition over our land, over our rights, is still very difficult and very overcomplicated. And even now, there are still many legislations being put out by the government that are continuing the very extractive mindset. The current movement of youths is very inspiring. Like, many of them are starting to come back to their village after seeing what has happened with the world, with climate change, because I think everybody is affected by climate change no matter where we are. But the people here, especially who are living near the forest, the youths, they are affected so much more than what they deserve, really, because they have been protecting it, and yet they are the ones that are affected so much. Like, there are so many cases that I have seen firsthand of where legislations actually stop the people living in the area to be able to even harvest wood, to even harvest firewood to cook their dinner, or to even use their land, I guess, which is heartbreaking and it's really cruel, honestly. I think I'd like to end with a quote that I still remember to this day, that one of the elders said to me a few months ago. And it's that now we can clearly see that the world is full of diseases. Back then, they had no medic, they had no doctors, and all they had were shamans and healers. And we had no modern medicine, we had only traditional ones. And these diseases that we see now are caused by our greed, our carelessness in using nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Keenan, for those wise words from somebody so young. I wondered, because you have said you're a filmmaker, is there anything that how do you feel that you are able to communicate or tell stories through your filmmaking? If you could just say something briefly about this experience of making films.
Yes, thank you. So from my films, I want to tell the world, I guess, how the indigenous people live, how we protect our forests, how we manage it, and also to sort of change the notion. Like, even to this day, there's such a preconception that indigenous people are, maybe the word would be savages or barbarians, which is simply not true. And that's the thing. Through my films, I want to do that, but also to preserve the knowledge. Like, there's so many indigenous traditions and wisdoms that we could learn from, that we could apply to our daily lives. I think all of us here can benefit from doing that. And also, I guess, to inspire more people to, I guess, raise their voice, because anybody everyone can make a difference, regardless of how small it is. And that's the goal of my films, honestly, to make a difference. Yeah.
Thank you, Keenan. It's such a treat to speak with you, and I think that your films do make a difference. You're absolutely right. Even a small difference makes a huge change. Thank you so much for that, and it's great to have you with us. I would like to just go back to Iliana, if she's available for that last, before we finish. If Iliana, you are available again for the final question that I had asked you before. Hi, sorry, I know how difficult it can be with internet connection. I don't know if you heard me, but I was wondering if you had some advice to us who are working globally for some of the things that you have mentioned, to, as you have said, bringing Indigenous peoples and local communities. And this is similar to some of the other messages we've been getting. From your experience, give us some advice at the international level of how we can hear better those voices that we need to listen to. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivonne. And I think, this is just a show of the many difficulties that around the world other colleagues are also facing in terms of ensuring connection. Well, so my advice, I would point out three very quickly issues that I think are very important, and I think colleagues have already mentioned this. The first one would be incorporate women, youth, indigenous peoples as right holders. It's not enough to ensure participation. This includes the recognition of the different forms of knowledge, of their knowledges and practices, and as it has also been mentioned, we know the recognition of rights is a precondition to develop capacities to improve agency and empowerment. Rights recognition is a key entry point to address existing inequalities, view engagement and participation not just as an add-on to fill out a requirement, but rather the obligation of acknowledging the rights of underrepresented groups. It's also an important precondition to address existing barriers and practices to engagement. My second point would be to strengthen and develop capacities to organize, to mobilize, to ensure information is available for informed decision-making. And I would say my third point would be to ensure we have legitimate representation of women, of indigenous peoples, of youth groups in different decision-making spaces, but not only during the implementation of interventions. I think we also need to in processes where there is design and where there is evaluation that we're learning. And I just wanted to close down with an example from my home country, Guatemala, where in a very recognized rights northern Petén region are highly insecure because they rely on political how communities can actually are able to match the forest in the northern region of the Tenures. What we have learned from our colleagues from our community organizations in the Petén region in Guatemala are providing important lessons of how these three different issues actually translate into investments for community livelihoods, but also investments in the forests that ensure sustainability at the long term. So thank you for the opportunity to come back and address this question.
Thank you so much, Iliana, and for making the effort to come back to be able to conclude the second part of your participation. Really appreciative of that, understanding well that it's not easy to get the same internet connection all over the world. So I wanted to say thank you to all. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. We've reached the conclusion of this first panel. We really appreciate showing us what your aspirations and hopes are with all the viewers, and especially for giving your time so generously. I know that it's not easy to find time with all the virtual meetings that we're having these days, but to help us celebrate World Wildlife Day, we are we show our gratitude to you for sharing your time with us on World Wildlife Day.